Good evening, everyone. Welcome to This is Public Space, an event hosted by Open House Melbourne, which is an organisation interested in public space, and Federation Square, which is a public space, but also an organisation interested in public space. It's part of Melbourne Conversations, which is a series that's organised by the City of Melbourne to bring together people like you to discuss the issues that are important to you. So if you enjoy what you hear tonight, I'm very confident that you will, keep your eyes out for future events in the Melbourne Conversation series because you'll probably enjoy them as well. My name is Jeff Sparrow. I work at the Centre for Advancing Journalism at the University of Melbourne, and I'll be your moderator for this evening. It's lovely to see so many people here on a Monday night in Melbourne town. Before we go any further, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land on which we are gathered, the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung and the Bunurong Boonwurrung peoples of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respect to their elders past and present. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land, which is in fact one of the issues we'll be discussing tonight. Now, before we go any further, a few quick housekeeping issues. I'm sure you'll be glued to your seat throughout the entirety of the proceedings, but if you do need to use the conveniences, they are located outside of the theatre, a sharp left after the stairs near the exit. If you have a mobile phone, now would be a good time to put it onto silent mode. Do not, however, turn it off, because we're going to have about 45 minutes chat on stage. Then after that, we'll be calling for your questions and comments. And you can send them through to the panel using a super sophisticated electronic system, which I'll do my best to explain now. Basically, you can submit your questions at any time by going to slido.com and entering the hashtag #publicspace. Or you can use the QR code you can see on the screen there. You can send your questions at any time and we will get to them before the end of the event. Please remember to be kind and constructive. And I should also say that the City of Melbourne Library is running a special pop-up library here tonight in the foyer. They have specially curated items that you are encouraged to borrow. You can borrow them using your library card. If you're not a library member, they'll sign you up on the spot. We're talking about public spaces. There is no space more public than your local library, so get amongst it while they're here. All right, that's about the end of my housekeeping. It's now that time in the evening where I'd like to call upon Councillor Griffiths to say a few words to us.
Well, thank you, Jeff, and what a pleasure it is to be here tonight on behalf of the City of Melbourne with my councillor colleague Raphael Camillo, who I'd like to acknowledge there. Fantastic to see so many passionate Melburnians packing out a space like this. I think we had about 1,300 RSVPs, which just goes to show how much Melburnians love their city and love to talk and hear about their city, and what an excellent opportunity we have for that tonight. I'd like to echo Jeff's acknowledgement of country, and on behalf of the City of Melbourne as well, pay my respects to the original elders of these unceded lands that we're meeting on tonight. It's an important thing that we always do in our council speeches. And I was particularly struck by one of the Melbourne Conversations that we had here. I think it was last year, it could have been the year before, where we were talking about the Birrarung, our beautiful river outside these glass doors, outside these windows, and its importance to both the original owners, but everyone else who has come afterwards. And this space just has such a beautiful aspect out there that it is an inspiring place to be able to do an acknowledgement of country. I would also like to encourage you not just to make use of things like the library staff, and a big shout out to them up the back tonight doing some fantastic work, but if you are the kind of Melburnian who likes to come and be part of these conversations, to hear from experts and to have your voices heard, I'd really encourage you to go and be part of that ongoing conversation that you can have with Council through our Participate Melbourne website. It's not hard to find. If you Google Participate Melbourne, you can go there and find a way to interact with Council about numerous conversations that are going on about the public realm and about many other things besides. And it's a great way to have your voices heard and to continue the kinds of conversations that will be starting tonight. A couple of the things that we've been doing there recently, literally last night we closed the consultation around the Royal Park Master Plan redevelopment. There's some opportunities there to talk about some of our smaller pocket parks like Chelmsford Street in Kensington and many other locations besides. So if you're the kind of engaged Melburnian who likes to come out on a Monday night to hear from experts and have great conversations, then I encourage you to be a part of that and to continue these dialogues going, be part of these fantastic Melbourne Conversations series which will be coming along right throughout the year, and make sure that you let all of your friends know if you're on social media where you are tonight, if you're having a good time, and make sure you enjoy yourself, and give big thanks to the people who are going to be speaking tonight who've given up their time to share their knowledge. I'm very grateful, the City of Melbourne is very grateful, and I'm sure we're going to have a fantastic night together tonight.
Hello and welcome. I'm Tanya Davidge. I'm the Executive Director and Chief Curator at Open House Melbourne. And This is Public is an Open House Melbourne program that's taken many forms over the years, first as a podcast and then as an annual conversation that launched the Open House Melbourne weekend. And now we're really thrilled to curate this conversation tonight with Melbourne Conversations in this absolutely remarkable venue provided by Fed Square, as we take This is Public out of the weekend to highlight all things public realm. We're starting with public space, an issue that's really close to my heart, and we hope this public conversation in this wonderful public place sparks discussion and offers insight into the complexity of our public spaces and places and their significance to our city and to our public life. Please enjoy. Thank you.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, it's now that time of the evening where it's my great pleasure to introduce to you the galaxy of stars we've assembled here for your edification and jollification. Like all stars, they move around, and so they're not sitting in the order that we practiced before, but that's all good. Okay, first we have Kim Dovey, who is the Chair of Architecture and Urban Design at the University of Melbourne, and the author of many books, the most recent of which is entitled The Spatial Logic of Informal Urbanism. We also have Claire Martin, who is the Associate Director at landscape architecture firm Oculus. She's previously worked with the Australian Institute of Landscape Architects and the International Federation of Landscape Architects to champion climate positive design. We have Katrina Sedgwick, who is the Director and CEO of the Melbourne Arts Precinct, responsible for overseeing the massive Melbourne Arts Precinct transformation and the management of Fed Square. And finally, we have Sarah Lynn Rees, who is a Palawa woman, an academic and designer at JCB Architects, where she's working to indigenise the built environment. Please join me in making them all feel welcome. All right, we've got a lot to talk about, and this is a complicated subject, so perhaps we should begin with some definitions. Kim, what do we mean when we talk about a public space? Do we mean a place that is designed for the public, a place that is governed by the public, a place that is used by the public, or is there some better way we can understand this concept?
I don't think there's going to be a single way of defining public space that is going to be acceptable to everybody. But I think that it's all of those things, but it is a space that is open to the public is first of all. We often use a phrase, public open space, which may or may not sound a bit like, do they mean the same thing, public and open? To some degree, I think they do, but public space means that it's open to everybody because the public means everybody. But then in a world where there are borders and there's various levels of access and control, that becomes very fuzzy, right? So there become many different kinds of publicness. The kind of public space that we're in now, and it's great to see so many people turn out to discuss public space in public space, and this is genuinely public space. It's open to everybody, if they can get into Australia, of course. So it's not, there are always boundaries around these things. And there are different kinds of publicness. You know, there is ticketed public space where you, if you buy a ticket, you can get there, you know, the train stations and so on. There is quasi-public space, the shopping malls, which are privately owned and controlled, but they're really open to everybody. And so there's many different kinds of, and I'm not trying to cast this is not my normal argument against shopping malls. I'll save that for another time. I'm going to stop there, Jeff, to leave it. Have I confused everyone enough?
To summarise, we might say it's complicated. Okay, well, let's move to you, Katrina. Fed Square is a huge area, and this Arts Precinct project covers an even huger area in terms of sort of geography, but also it's a space that's used in lots of different ways by lots of different people. Is there a single definition that helps you to understand the function of this space, or are you working on different definitions? How would you think about it?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting idea. I had been thinking about public space, certainly in this context, as the open space, the stuff that's not inside a building, the stuff that's not kind of mediated by a wall and a door. Having said that, of course, there's 3 wonderful public institutions resident here where it is open to anybody, and we want people to get through that door. So from that perspective, I suppose we have been looking after Fed Square now for a couple of years and really thinking about this open space, this opportunity as a kind of a platform for the public, for the people of Melbourne, for the visitors of Melbourne to come together in the context of our Civic and Cultural Charter, which was a kind of cornerstone to the brief that went into the architectural competition. It is a place of gathering, it is a place of meeting, it is a place of protest, of celebration. It's a place to express who you are, to see yourself reflected in that space. As part of that, its sort of civic purpose is providing a safe, free, accessible space for all people to be able to come together and be together in their diversity and in their particularity. And so our function as the people who run it are to work with many, many partners, the residents here within this building, but many, many partners, including, of course, City of Melbourne, to activate, enable, invite, engender ownership and pride, civic pride in this space so that it's felt to be collectively owned, I suppose, by the people of Melbourne. And maybe that's the different thing, is that public space is owned by the public as opposed to many other things that sit inside buildings.
I mean, I feel that there's a lot there to tease out. I'm sure we'll come back to many of these issues. And again, I would remind all of you you can send in your questions at any time. But just to expand on the idea of the public, Claire, when we talk about public space, I think for a lot of us, we tend to think about ideas of public ownership. We think about public transport and so forth. But of course, the idea of public ownership in the traditional way of state ownership is a very politically unpopular term these days. And even when we look at, you know, something like the big build in Victoria, we talk about public-private partnerships. So I wonder if you could discuss how we might think about public space in relation to private ownership and the involvement of private corporations. What does that mean for this concept of a space for the public?
Yeah, I mean, I think that what both Kim and Katrina have alluded to is obviously the role of public space for people, and I think maybe a good way of thinking about it is a little bit more holistic, so not just thinking about people, but thinking about public space as public realms, so ideas of systems and the very connective landscapes that we live in. And so if you think about it not purely in the sort of binary of public and private, which is ultimately sort of a colonial kind of construct that is about extracting wealth from something that is ostensibly perceived to be free, then we can start to understand how to leverage the value of private realm. And so I think what the City of Melbourne has done in their C376 planning amendment is understand that as they only own about 30% of the city's land, they need to be able to extract value in a good way for public benefit of privately owned land. And that's because a lot of that land was sold off, in particular in the 90s. Some of it's owned by universities who are major landholders. So I think we have to understand that it's not just about ownership, although that is important because it sets governance and controls, sets permissions and certain types of behaviours. But we actually need to understand that our city is massively connected, and when it works well, it needs to work as a system. And that means that you have to transcend ownership and maybe challenge some ideas of governance. And so I think some of those planning amendments are really about understanding the need, especially for greening, to actually really maximise private contribution for public and community benefit.
Well, that leads me very nicely onto my next question. Sarah, I began with the traditional acknowledgement of country and the ongoing relationship of Indigenous people to the land on which we are meeting today. Of course, in a colonial settler state, for the settlers, when they thought of something being public, they would only think about it as public when they had dispossessed the Indigenous owners of it. So I wonder if you could talk us through how we might think about public space in the year 2025 in perhaps a decolonial way, you know, whether there are particular Indigenous ways of thinking about the relationship to the land that might be relevant in this context. You know, as we just touched upon, I guess the public-private distinction comes back, you know, from the classical Greek civilization. Maybe it doesn't work in different cultures. So perhaps you could talk a little bit about what it might mean to decolonialise our ideas of public space.
How long have you got? I think I'd start by challenging this idea of defining it as public space in general, because public inherently means people, and by virtue of designing something for the public, you're then designing out other things. And the structure of the legacy of colonisation in terms of design then means that we are considering plants and landscapes as aesthetic or ornament rather than habitat. We're conceiving of the way that we think of, let's say, a public park. One of my favourite conversations with Claire earlier on, that, you know, we're designing it for human safety, but in doing so, we actually completely cut out either the understory or the mid-story, which is really critical for habitat, and sharing those spaces and having relationships with non-human kin. So everything that we're doing in terms of the design of our public space is for human benefit, and the question is, who out of that human benefit, because it's certainly not for everyone, but it ostensibly designs out the right of every other living being, or depends on how you define living being, but in an Indigenous context, to me, everything is living. And that should be a crime, as far as I'm concerned, because we're, as Claire pointed out, completely messing with natural systems and understanding the way that country needs to be cared for in order to be healthy, just so that we have spaces for public use, for people. So I think that there needs to be a complete shift in the way that we think about what is public space, that actually starts to consider not just how we coexist with non-human kin or with animals or with plants or natural systems and waterways, how we actually start to understand our relationship as human beings in this time with all of those elements of that system. I mean, you look at the river's been widened, it's been dredged, it's been straightened so that it becomes less of a risk to property. And the way that river needs to work is it needs to actually be in flux, it needs to flood, it needs to bring those nutrients from other places to replenish the soils to be healthy for the plants. But we design out all of those things because they're not for the benefit of humans and they're not for the benefit of human property. So I guess that possibly a fundamental reshift in the way that we think about designing spaces and remembering that it's not just for human beings.
Well, perhaps we could tease that out a little more. I mean, I know that some jurisdictions have moved to assign agency and even legal rights to non-human agents like rivers. Is that something that you would like to see happen in our discussions of public space in Australia? Should we be thinking about the river as part of the Melbourne public?
Absolutely. I mean, the Birrarung is considered a living entity. It has a council that speaks on its behalf. I don't know what power that council actually has. And so that's where I would question what, we can put these structures in place and we can understand that the first step is to recognise that they do have rights, like the river has rights, country has rights, our animals and insects have rights, but what power do the structures that we put in place to give them those rights actually have to enact on those? Because I don't think that currently exists.
Right, Katrina, if we're talking about a square, I think a lot of people would think, when they hear the word square, would think about the European context and the traditional town square, which always seemed to me to imply a particular relationship with the natural world, a very traditional one based around ideas of sort of dominance and control. When you're working in Fed Square and with the broader projects in which you're involved, and you're trying to rethink the relationship with the environment and nature as a whole, do you find yourself coming up against people's preconceptions as to what a public space should be like, which go back to those kind of European norms? I mean, do we need a process of education to help people to think about what the relationship with the Australian environment might entail?
I mean, just listening to what Sarah was saying, I was just thinking about what a heritage listing does and the privileging a heritage listing gives to the buildings, in fact, over all of the functions. It's, in terms of that kind of colonial layering. And it's interesting because this is, of course, a contemporary heritage listed site, and it's a complex and very conceptual series of buildings. It's fulfilling a function that the citizenry of Melbourne had been yearning for decades, and that was to have a central square, absolutely considered in the European tradition. And I was thinking about it this morning, actually, the way that often European squares work, and particularly not the kind of big, vast plazas, but some of those more intimate squares, which probably reflect about the size of ours, is that lots of people live around them. There's a whole kind of ecology of living things that are there activating. That is their garden, that is their place. And the challenge here is that we have a whole series of buildings with a lot of fascinating, interesting activity that's happening in it, but people have to visit it always. So I suppose what we're trying to think about is how do we ensure that there is, as I said previously, that it doesn't feel exclusionary, that there is, as I say, a built platform that is a powerful platform. It's a demonstration of power in its very construction in the first place. How do people access that and use that power to express, as I say, their identity, their culture, the diversity of this place? Within that, I think there's a whole lot of challenges around the extreme heat that is arriving and going to be more and more intense, and obviously species collapse. And so how do we tackle that in this space and ensure that we do have more of those other living things that are crucial for us all to survive in this space? And even just as simple as how do we get more shade? It's a really important thing. I would say that the philosophy behind all of that is just, if you are a town square in the middle of the city, then everything you do is about partnership. Everything is about amplification. Everything is about connecting with other organisations and saying, how can we work with you? It's almost polar opposite. I'll be as quick as I can in this answer because I'm talking a lot. But but it's almost polar opposite in the sense of the work we're doing across the way with the arts precinct transformation. There is a very large building going in there, which will be the Fox NGV Contemporary, which will be magnificent, and an extension of the very successful 2 campuses that already exist for the National Gallery of Victoria. And Arts Centre Melbourne is being enhanced with wonderful changes and so on. But the other really exciting part is Lark Bundap, which is being approached in a quite different way to public space, in that most of that platform, that deck that connects those buildings and connects us from Princes Bridge through to the rest of South Bank, will be green. Will be soil and plants and trees and hopefully a whole series of creatures with that. And I think that that's quite a radical departure from how so much of urban public space is approached these days. And I think it's going to be exciting and quite transformative.
Claire, Katrina's nicely segued into what I was going to ask you, which is simply that if we are talking about, well, not just public space, but any major long-term planning now, we have to factor in that the world of the future is not going to be the same as the world of the past, or indeed the world of the present, particularly in relation to climate. So how do we think about that in terms of the public space that we need in the years to come? We have a climate that we know is changing. We don't necessarily know exactly how it's going to change or how that's going to manifest. What does a climate-friendly public space involve? What should we be looking for?
Yeah, I mean, I do agree with Katrina. I think that project will set a new benchmark, and I think that's what we need. We always need case studies to build on to demonstrate that these things are possible. And I would add that what comes with Katrina's public space is a different approach to care and cultivation, otherwise known as gardening, instead of landscape maintenance. So that's a really important distinction that I'm very excited about. I mean, I think that what we know is that heat is the biggest killer in Australia of any natural disaster. It will continue to kill and make people very sick, and actually it directly affects productivity, so there's a financial impact to that as well, let alone the community well-being aspect. It also isn't very good for biodiversity either, so we know that that's causing quite a lot of change in terms of migratory patterns and other impacts on Melbourne's biodiversity. So I think we know what to do, and I guess, again, the City of Melbourne knows what to do. They've got some really good strategies, albeit not to say they're totally uncontested, but I think we know we need more canopy. We definitely need more understory and more mid-story, but we also need to think about our public realm not just as destinations. So it's not just about when you get there, it's actually about the walk there. It's about the connectivity. So, and yes, we're in Melbourne, and yes, Melbourne has lots of gardens and lots of different types of public space, but I think it's really more an equity issue when we start to go out into the suburbs and we understand, there's a lot of evidence about the disparity between canopy. We also know that we're not necessarily setting up the right conditions for trees to thrive. So even if the City of Melbourne is planting a lot of trees, if those trees don't thrive, your canopy doesn't extend. And we know there are other councils with bigger challenges. Again, the C376 planning amendment was about 40% green cover, and that's because Australia is the most urbanised country in the world. So we have 80% of our people already living in cities, 30% of threatened species already living in cities. So that means other forms of vertical greening, green roofs, green facades, which again are not without complexity, but definitely viable. So I think it means that we need to look at things more holistically, and I think we also need to add water into the mix as well. So I think we know that flooding will cause the most damage, and so we actually need to accommodate for the sort of changes that Sarah was alluding to. We can't constrain and confine. We've got the technology in terms of soils, in terms of structures. We know that buildings have to do the heavy lifting, and that's why I think we don't need to think about it as space between buildings, but about all of the systems that create the grounding of those buildings and the interconnectedness of those communities. But we are creating unlivable suburbs, and that will have significant health and productivity impacts, and in particular for livelihoods as well.
I get your thoughts on that, Kim. How well do you think Melbourne is prepared for what is coming seemingly at a frighteningly quick pace? What do we need to be doing as a matter of priority to prepare our public spaces for the climate we're about to encounter?
Very complex questions, but I suppose to be maybe a little controversial, I'd like to maybe counter some of the discourse on the idea that a green city is one with better planting or more planting or something. Dense cities are green cities. Indeed, I would say that density is probably the thing that is greenest about cities, because density in its best sense. I know we often have a negative concept of what density means, but densities bring people closer together. They bring us within walking distance of each other and of the places we need to go, of the schools, of the hospitals, of the employment, and within walking distance and within cycling distance. And they build the support for reducing the amount of car space that there is in the city, which is one of the big issues. So my sense is that trying to understand more about these relationships between density and the way in which we mix different activities in the city, including open space, because one of the big functions of public open space is to serve as the living room, the everyday living room, for those people who don't have private open space. Right, so we live in a city that is a relic of a car-driven ideology for most of Melbourne, out in the suburbs. And we need, I think, the main answer to your question, Jeff, is that we need to turn that around into being a much less car-dependent city, a much more walkable city, a much more public transport city. And that means getting serious about density. And I'm not here trying to get on a political bandwagon of one kind or another, because I don't think either political party has been really grappling with the real issues of density, which are to do with the small grain urban design. How do we build density without destroying the amenity and the attraction that attracted people there in the first place?
I was just looking at...
Though is compromising some of the greening strategies, hence why there's sort of daylight planning amendments. I think it is, the density is important, but I think it's the right type of density. And we have a very extreme level of density and then an extreme level of sprawl. So I think it's probably just to support the walkable, the cyclable, you need the greening, and that does necessitate the right planning.
Agree more.
Excellent. Agreement is breaking out on the panel. I was just looking at my phone there because I was checking the Slido, and your questions are coming through. I see there is a question about how we get the cars out of the city. We'll get to all of those in good time. But I want to now turn to, again, it's something else that you guys have already raised, but the question of the public as a democratic concept. When we're talking about the public, we've already said we mean everybody, we mean trying to include the excluded, but I think a lot of us might have a sense that some of the prestige public spaces may well be used more by some people who already have a certain degree of privilege than other people. So my first question, I guess, and I'll start with you, Sarah, but all of you feel free to jump in. Do we have a sense, do we have figures about who is using our public space, what kinds of people, and the level of equity that prevails in there? And the follow-up from that is, if we feel that they're not being used equitably, how might we change that?
I can't answer the figures question. I'm not a stats person, but I guess I can turn it around from the other perspective and think about the kinds of briefs that we get across our desk and the invitation of who we're designing for, particularly in public spaces, be they along the river or be they embedded along the coast or within cities and urban environments. And I guess there's two ways to think about this. One is that there's this general idea of the public or the constituents or the demographic of a particular region is who you're designing for, but then there's also a target audience of who you're designing for, and that's generally fairly explicit, and that doesn't include everyone. All people, I should say, let alone animals or insects or everyone else. The other way of thinking about it is, I guess, the legacy that we're still navigating, in that the city itself, this area would have been filled with manna gum trees and river red gum trees, and behind us there would have been a swampland that led into the arts precinct, which was a whole brackish wetland, and there were all of these natural systems that would have existed in this place that have been dominated out. As with people, if you come across any city that has a boundary road, that typically is the exclusion line for certain people to be able to enter into or not enter into, or at different times of day can occupy that space or another. We're very good at creating boundaries, even down to the public-private ownership concept, where a site has a boundary outline, and that has many connotations, both to the extent that which you can influence something through design, but then also who manages it and who pays for it. And a lot of these, questions at the end of the day come down to who is actually going to look after that place and where that boundary line is. And sometimes you're designing something that, if you think about Green Line, for example, has so many different owners, so many different users, so many people who have the rights to use that particular piece of land, that it's not actually conceived of from a bureaucratic point of view as one straight line of landscape that intersects with the river. It's owned by about 37 different organisations. I'm making that number up, but to accentuate a point. And then the river itself has different people that have the right to be able to use it at different times of day, whether it's rowing or whether it's the boats, or whether we have all this performative relationship with place and who has the right to use it when. But yeah, look, I don't know. I think there has to be a whole bit of a revolution, really. I'd love to get my hands on planning documents. I think that would be great fun. Anybody who's ever seen me speak at a public talk will know that's one of my favourite lines. Because if you want to create, change at scale, you actually have to change the documents that govern how we do these things. I was saying earlier, I'd love to get my hands on any local council's planting succession plan, because then you can actually get in there and cross out all of the exotic species that we're still replacing exotic species with, and challenge the notion of, well, could they be native? Could they be indigenous? How do we create those kind of environments? I'm going on a bit of a tangent, but even the question about canopy, where we are right now and this area of landscape up here would have had somewhere between 20 to 40% canopy cover. Some areas, the brackish wetland, would have had none. There's no nuance in the way that we're talking about what should be here, and I think that's probably something that we should be focusing on.
Well, I'm happy to talk about the revolution that we need to have, but that might be for another session. But Katrina, perhaps I can come back to you with your position. Do you have a sort of sense of who is using the areas that you're responsible for, the kinds of people who are making use of these spaces, and perhaps the kinds of people who we might want to be encouraging to use them who aren't?
Well, I mean, for somewhere like Fed Square, it's about very intentional partnership and programming. Things don't just happen. People do feel excluded. The boundaries are real. And, people don't even come into the city. They don't even feel invited to come into the city. So it is about conscious investment, conscious partnership, and prioritising effectively. And we did this. I used to be the director at ACME, and we were closed for a while doing a big kind of redevelopment. And when we opened, it was sort of short, about a year after COVID had finished. And we did this pilot program where we did anonymised mobile phone data, which is just fascinating. So you could actually compare the difference in our visitors between 2019 and 2022 from the anonymised mobile phone data. So you could see where people had started their journey from, that they'd come in, and then where they finished, so that you could actually get accurate postcode data. And over the course of the time that we'd closed, we'd done a lot of analysis and gone, well, who is missing from our audience? What are the partnerships we need to do to help foster and support that? And there were a whole range of partnerships which were long and deep and complex and very specific. But we found through this hard data that an immediate difference was made. We went from the top 10 postcodes that visited ACME the most, being almost entirely inner city, leafy green suburbs and Geelong. Suddenly Werribee, suddenly the City of Casey, a whole lot of places where we had targeted partnerships that were meaningful, or where we'd spent our marketing money differently. Instead of spending a whole lot of marketing money around events we were doing in Carlton, we were spending them in other places. and people came. So I think a lot of it has to be intentional, and it has to be about, particularly for public institutions, using the subsidy, the taxpayers' money, in an effective way that is very conscious in saying who needs to be invited, who doesn't feel currently invited. If we say everybody who is being excluded by us doing the traditional things and going to the traditional audiences, who come anyway, and saying to other people, come. And surprisingly enough, they do.
Claire, the other aspect, I guess, about talking about the public in this way is the relationship between public spaces and the democratic process. Because when we're talking about public spaces, we're also talking about the places where people come together to hold meetings, to hold demonstrations, protests, other ways that people assert particular positions or ideas. And in the history of Melbourne, there's always been a certain, how shall I put it, anxiety about these kind of manifestations of public space when it comes to building squares or areas around outside Parliament House or whatever. There's certain unease, people in power in relation to this. So I wonder about your thoughts on this. Is there a relationship between geography and the political process? Do we need these public spaces to assert our democratic rights, or is it the assertion of our democratic rights that gives us these public spaces in a way? How would you see that connection between the spaces that we're talking about and the kind of vibrant democracy that we might like to have?
Yeah, that's a good and a big question again. I don't know. I mean, I think that you can't separate the two. I mean, we are always grounded in place, and institutions, for better or worse, are always place-based as civic institutions. So I think you need to make the space for that. I think increasingly we're seeing more sensitivity around how we design those spaces. I think there's sort of the good and the bad. So I guess we've seen obviously some unfortunate incidents happen globally and in Melbourne around the use of vehicles to cause harm as a form of, in different levels of protest or just from people who are very unwell. And so I think that we're now seeing this sort of really extreme regulation of space based on the management of hostile vehicle mitigation. We're seeing, obviously, the use of things like crime prevention through environmental design, which is really, really critical in terms of, but again comes with its constraints in terms of what it means for planting. So there's a lot of regulation that is controlling the way that people move and the way that people congregate, and some of this is legislated from a federal kind of policy. But I think we need to accommodate all of these things, and that's a really tricky thing to do. But I think what we're starting to see is that to increase participation and the way that people can feel invited to actually even get to the door, things like strategies around gender-sensitive urban design. So we've been involved with the ACT government on some of their strategies, and I think it's about acknowledging that a city that is designed well for women is designed well for everyone, and it really starts to think through planning and people's participation and involvement at the scale of the state, right the way down to even the industrial design of tram sort of handles. So it really starts to think about the embodied relationships between people and their city, and that's not just for protest, but it is for day-to-day life. And I guess what is good about designing public spaces, you have to design for the everyday and you have to design for the event, and that's really hard, that level of flexibility, that level of being free, being, supporting understory, but at the same time confining movement is really, really tricky. But I think the thing that we mostly learnt from doing that gender-sensitive work was that it's not just about the outcome, it's about the way that you procure the project. It's a way that you have sensitivity in the way that you design the brief. It's about your design team. So a lot of our cities have historically been designed by men who are designers, architects, engineers. That is changing, and as a result of different diversity in the design process, you get different lived experience, and therefore you get different outcomes. And so I think we've realised that, yes, there's the scale matters, and then there's just, just a whole load of urban design qualities and elements that you have to really think through. And that's from a cultural perspective as well. It's not just around gender, but it's just about starting to understand, actually speaking to people about their lived experience, making it place specific, as well as having to accommodate all of these different regulations. So it is complicated, but it is possible. But I think we just need to have meaningful engagement, and we also need to understand, I think in the way that Katrina was saying, that, Fed Square is very open, the next space will be, much greener. We don't want to aggregate everything. If we aggregate everything, then there's no difference, there's no diversity, there's no point in moving between all these spaces.
Kim, we've talked about definitions of the public. What we haven't talked about is definitions of space. And I wonder if after the experience of the pandemic and COVID, whether we need to extend the way we think about public space into the online realm as well, and whether you have any thoughts about this. I mean, I remember, when that Pokemon Go thing first came out, and that experience of watching the kids all go through the City of Melbourne chasing the bloody Pokemon things up and down, and feeling there is this really interesting way that people are both relating to the physical space but also the virtual space. Do you think this needs to be part of the conversation about public space, the way we relate to the virtual world?
So, Jeff, I'm going to try and dispense with the COVID question reasonably fast, because I think we need to get over COVID and back to, in a sense, of a reset, because I think COVID did a lot of damage to public space, mostly through, it did some good things as well. Yeah, we learned how to re-engage with some aspects of public space, but we also got into a kind of a spatial distancing mode, which I think was very damaging to urban life, and that really we need to get over that and get back to where we were, and not worry too much about the next pandemic, even though at some point it will come. But I wanted to get back into engage with that political question, because I think there's a reasonably straight answer from my point of view to that, which is that that it's not really public space if it's not open to politics. And the test for that is it open to the organised criticism of the state, the organised and sustained criticism of the state. Okay, and I think that's being tested a little bit in Melbourne at the moment. I remember when Fed Square was first opened, and we Australia were a party to the invasion, the illegal, let's face it, it was against international law, the illegal invasion of Iraq, which proved to be a complete disaster, but that's neither here nor there. And the massive protests against that were happening in Fed Square. Fed Square was very new at the time. Over time, that's moved to the State Library, and there'd be a range of reasons for that. And so while I'd say that Fed Square is one of the better designed and managed public spaces in Melbourne, it's not the most public in that sense. The most public space in Melbourne probably is the space in front of the library. For a range of reasons. One is that it's space that's been claimed back from a kind of from both social class. It was originally, the forecourt of the library was originally fenced off as a kind of a secluded kind of bourgeois upper class realm. You weren't allowed to simply wander in there off the street. And the fences have been taken down. It's become genuinely public. It's very integrated, both with the adjacent university and the surrounding streets and the shopping malls and so on, much more than Fed Square is. Fed Square is, with all its benefits, is on the edge of the city. It's a place we go to rather than through, whereas the library is a place you go through. It's much more integrated. It's a space that has been largely claimed back from cars. There's hardly any cars actually go around that area. And it's a space that's become highly politicised and available for demonstrations. So I think that's in many ways the real test of a genuinely public space. Is it available when the crunch comes for citizens to get together and engage in free speech against the state?
And of course, in its early years, the library wasn't open on Sundays, which was the one day that working class people were able to attend. And those opening hours were extended by a series of mass demonstrations in which many people were in prison. So it's actually a really interesting point to think about. We have the right to go to the public library because people went to jail for it. We are rapidly running out of time, I regret to say. Please keep those questions coming. I'm not actually able to look at my phone until I get to that, but I'm sure they're all coming. I have faith in the technology. But what I did want to do before we move to that, and I prepared you guys for this earlier on, was to get each one of you to give us an example of a public space, could be in Melbourne or anywhere around the world, that you think really works. That if you had to show it to someone as an example of what can happen in a public space, what makes a public space important, where would be that spot and what would you say to the person? Who would like to go first?
Go first just because I was going to say the State Library, and the reason I was going to say that is because it has the right ingredients. So it's not necessarily about the design as much as it is the elements that all come together. So it is, yes, it is next to a very specific 19th century cultural institution, but it's mainly that it has great prospect, it has good aspect, it has good solar access, it is very carefully protected through planning law. It has a good mix of education, of retail, of residential, so it's a total mix. It's easy to get to on foot and by public transport generally, so I think it has all of the right elements, and I think it also, it's not that complicated. It's reasonably accessible. So I think it's more about the ingredients as much as anything else, and not sort of forgetting what aspect and prospect do in terms of public space.
So one vote for the State Library. Katrina?
Well, I am going to say Fed Square, and just push back a little bit on your comments because I absolutely agree. It's so one of the most thrilling things I think is the way that forecourt has been claimed for protest, and that expression is just so particular. To the identity of Melbourne, I suppose. I think it's fantastic. But I think what's interesting here is lots of people come through here to walk along Burrung Ma, to go up to the Sports and Entertainment Precinct. Fed Square is now officially the gateway to the Arts Precinct, and of course it's the beginning for the many, many visitors who are coming up from this side of the city into the sort of the retail and cultural and civic and whatever complexity. So, and you know, since the new year, the square has been full 7 times, most recently on Friday night. So a lot of people are coming for a range of very different kinds of, largely concerts, and that sort of diversity of audience is really exciting. But what I love about Melbourne, and what I think is a really interesting thing with public space, and I come from Adelaide, and I would never ever venture into these spaces in Adelaide at night, is the reclaiming of the public space of the alleyways, which was a really kind of conscious decision by the city, you know, through urban planning, and Rob Adams was kind of really key to that, and licensing and all those sorts of things enabled it. But it's so wonderful that you can walk down these nooks and crannies in this major city and discover all these hidden, wonderful things and feel pretty safe. I mean, I would never ever do it in Adelaide. There's just not enough people around. It's scary. I mean, that's changed a bit now. I haven't lived there for 10 years or so, but I think that's magical in this city in terms of those different kinds of public spaces and what they've done to the character of this very urban environment.
Kim, I mean, if you wanted to continue the debate, you could immediately nominate the State Library again, or somewhere else.
Say it again, Jeff.
Would you like to nominate a place?
Oh, since I already nominated the front of the library, I think I'll go to the other extreme and say that it's really important with public space that you, especially in a big city, that we design spaces well that give people a full range of experiences. I'm coming to what the place might be, but I wanted to say one of the things that is particular about public space is you don't know who's going to use it, and you don't know what it's going to be used for. So my background is urban design and architecture, and I'm always dealing with students who want to say, well, what am I designing for? And in public space, the answer is you're designing for a multiplicitous community, meaning many, many different people from many different backgrounds, and it gets more complex than that because Australia is changing demographically very fast, and so you actually don't know the cultural background of the populations who are going to be using this space in the future. And you're always designing for, hundreds of years of use, if you like. So you're looking a long way ahead. So you're really designing for diverse possibility and then trying to focus on the things that we have in common. And then I'll get to the place. I was thinking of St Kilda Pier, actually, and the way in which, Melbourne's a great design city. There's lots of argument about how to do these things, whether to keep the old kiosk, whether not to keep the old kiosk. I think we've got a few things right there. Sarah's firm's been involved in that, but it's not just the pier, it's the general way in which the design approach to that precinct, I think, including their firm, has designed for a very, very broad range of possibilities. It's not about one thing. It's not putting in some gym equipment for the gym lovers and a skate park for the skateboarders and so on. It's a very complex issue, designing public space for a range of possibilities into the future to make it affordable, not in the economic sense, but to have a whole lot of affordances that you haven't even conceived of yet, meaning it's going to be used by people and you don't know what they want. Very tough task.
Sarah.
Thanks. Look, I am going to struggle to answer this question, mostly because I think most of the public spaces that we have in Australia and Melbourne have erased the identity of the place that they're in completely. And so it's very difficult to actually encounter a public space where we are that actually talks about where we are. Everything is an imported style of architecture from somewhere else. There's a trend towards globalism, the idea that we create landscape around buildings instead of buildings within landscapes. I could just reel off a whole bunch of things, but I would like to go to a public space that actually is made of, conceived of the place that it is, and tells me where I am in the world. So, I mean, the first example that comes to mind is like Park Royal in Barcelona, where, I mean, I can't speak to the design process and I can't speak to, the conception of it, but the experience of it and understanding that, the stone that's used from the site is actually then turned into the bridges and roadways that run through the park itself, and that the plants and the ecologies and the habitat get to coexist with humans in a really beautiful, peaceful way. And there's a celebration of art within that landscape. And look, I don't know if it's perfect. I don't know how it came to be. I don't know the process, but places like that have a sense of magic to them that allow you to connect to them in a way that I don't think our public spaces have afforded us the opportunity to do. They're designed typically in Australia for a purpose or for a multitude or for every purpose, and none of those purposes seem to be the ability to connect to country or the environment or nature unless they're a park, like maybe Royal Park or something. But we don't get to have those in our urban environments, and I think that's problematic.
Well, you've sold me on that park anyway. I would like to go and visit that. All right, we have 15 minutes now for questions from the floor. If I can get this thing to work. Okay. I have experienced many of Melbourne's public spaces are barren of shade and or wind tunnels. Are we getting better at design that matches our weather? I guess that goes a little bit to the climate change question as well. Who would like to tackle that?
Yes, I probably should as the landscape architect. Yeah, look, I think this is where we come back to some of the challenges of trying to design for flexibility, of trying to design for even equity. There are certain things that we are required to do that do necessitate a certain amount of hard surfaces. There are certain things, I mean, it takes time to establish trees. It certainly is very hard to establish trees in shade, in high wind. So there's a lot of complexity to designing public spaces in the city when it is a heavily modified environment. So I mean, I would like to think that we've contributed to some improvements in the city. I certainly think that we advocate for more understory, as Sarah was alluding to. So I think, I wouldn't say they're more barren, but I do think that the increased density comes with increased population, and that comes with increased spatial requirements. And then I do think this idea of having to design for sort of sometimes infinite flexibility and activation can be at times detrimental to having more, I guess, definitely more greening and certainly a less barren outcome, let's say.
Any of the rest of you want to jump on that? Otherwise, we'll move to the next one.
Just a quick one. I think the wind tunnel effects or the wind effects at ground level are very often created by tall buildings, but they're only created by tall buildings under certain urban design conditions, and they can be ameliorated. So if we get away from this notion that density means one thing, either you go high-rise or you don't have development. This polarised debate that has had such a grip in Melbourne for so long has really got to go. There are really good ways to get density with lots of green, with lots of open space. Sort of family-friendly density is really quite possible. We haven't really grappled with that for Melbourne suburbs very much. But instead we do things like take off the height limits. The area up just south of the Vic Market is a kind of a bit of a disaster zone in terms of the wind effects which are created by doing very tall buildings right on the street frontage. And we know how to stop that happening. It's a planning problem.
All right, I think I've got more of a sense how this thing works now. Apparently people vote on the questions, and the one that's got the overwhelming number of votes, and good luck answering this, is how can we get cars out of the CBD? Katrina.
Better public transport.
What was that?
Better public transport.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be really interesting to see what the impacts of metro are and how much that kind of shifts and changes the city and the use of the city and the accessibility of the city with some really powerful, fast people movement. I don't know. I mean, I think that's a question for council, but, there's so many, there's a few really incredible models, and I'm sure everyone here or many people here know about Copenhagen and the kind of many decades of very clever kind of public planning where sort of roads would suddenly become clogged with traffic, or not suddenly, over time become clogged with traffic, and the decision was to, rather than expand the roads, was to shrink the roads and make it even harder for cars to navigate and make it easier for people to cycle and walk along those exact roads. And of course cars found a different way because it was too hard. And that kind of logic has lent to many, many, many more square metres of public space, space devoted to people and plants across that city, and has greatly enhanced its livability through planning. So,
yeah, I mean, I think the City of Melbourne, in their defence, has done some of that, and certainly looked at and has done it in permanent ways, like the conversion of 2/3 of Market Street into the first public park in Melbourne since City Square in the 90s, and also through temporary closures and other closures in West Melbourne and other parts. So I think that certainly has informed the city's strategies, and I think that, yes, deliberately making it harder for cars to move around the city has happened, and has happened partly as a product of Metro, and I think we'll start to see, and probably has already informed some behaviours as well. So,
public transport has a huge impact on the way in which public space works, and so investment in public transport is far more productive in terms of public space than investment in more roads. We spent 100 years building roads, and we've really hardly started rebuilding the public transport system.
If you want to answer the question from a technical, boring point of view as well, like, you've got to figure out how to solve emergency vehicle access, fire truck access, waste access in a way that doesn't mean that you're just designing a soft road. So that's something that really has to be thought about in a critical lens. You're not just replacing a road with another vehicle access way. How do you actually replace it to have a genuine regreening or whatever it might be of the city itself. So like we actually have to address all of those systems as well as the design of the space.
Yeah, I think the waste one is the biggest one. I think there's precedent for that in Barcelona, and I think the city has looked at that, how to actually vacuum all of the waste out of the city to get rid of the trucks would probably be the biggest one actually to unlock it.
So the question with the current highest votes at the moment, I suspect we've kind of answered this. What is a favourite international example of public space that Melbourne could take inspiration from?
Melbourne shouldn't take inspiration from international spaces. Sorry, but we have too much of that. We actually need to invent what is of here, not...
We need another Ferris wheel, Sarah.
No, I don't.
Although your example was an international example in a good way, because it had specificity, didn't it? So I guess that's the point.
All right, the other question, which is rapidly shooting up the charts, what is the panel's opinion on the proposed banning of protests in public space?
I don't think you should ban protests in public space.
I don't think you should ban protests in public space.
I already had my say on that.
Yeah, don't ban them.
I am also against banning them. Okay, there are tensions in the draft Royal Park master plan, balancing recreation versus ecology and traditional owner engagement. What should the master plan prioritise? Look, you wouldn't be here if it was easy.
Yeah. Oh no, I mean, again, how long have you got? I think part of the problem is that the master plans are conceived of over like 2, 5, 10, 15 years, and in fact we should be possibly doing 200-year master plans that start to speak to the longer term value of what we want to see as a future to be. Like, you know, you plant a tree and you don't see it grow up, that kind of language. But I don't actually know the particulars of that particular master plan, so I'll probably need to go and look it up. But a master plan should be a reflection of the values of traditional custodians, the aspirations to care for country, what the identity of place is through materiality, through flora, through fauna, the presence of all of those ecosystems and natural systems existing together, and the ability for humans to interact with all of those elements without destroying them.
I don't like the idea of the master plan. A master plan implies that there's a plan, and at some point in the future, when we have found the resources and had the time, then we'll get there and it'll be fixed. That's not the way cities work. No, we have to get much, much more agile. Look, I think the pandemic, if it proved anything to us, is that things change in unpredictable ways and we don't know what's going to happen, and what we need to do is to get much more agile. We need to develop the capacity to change and to change constantly in relation to an unknown future and throw out all the master plans. That doesn't mean we don't have to have plans, but we just take away the word master. It implies fixity, and it implies that somehow everything will be okay if only I had the money. And that whole idea that we've actually got all the information we need to know what kind of perfect future might happen is not right. We need to get away from that entirely.
I think I would say we should throw out bad master plans and keep the good ones, but we need a plan, otherwise everything goes rogue. We're a society that's organised around local, well, you know, a university campus, a local council. There are so many arms that don't necessarily talk to each other within those organisations. Without a master plan of some description, we will end up with such a hodgepodge of a place that, I mean, we already have, so.
But what about diagnostic planning? Looking at the city that we have now and look at areas that don't have enough public space, and then we have a strategy for getting more public space in those areas and moving incrementally towards that without any fixed future, right? Because that condition, that diagnosis will continually change anyway. So I'm into having diagnostic mapping and capacity mapping. Look at where the capacities for change are now. What can we do by next year? What can we do by the year after? And so on. And become more agile, right? Become more adaptable.
I might have to move you away from plans because we've got another issue that you need to solve, and we've got 4 minutes to do it. Jake wants to know, third spaces, that is places other than home or work, are on the decline in Australia. Are our public spaces well equipped to deal with this challenge? Perhaps someone might want to explain the third space concept is part of the answer?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it can be technically anything that isn't home or work. So by definition, it could be, and this is obviously, again, post-COVID, people are working in lots of different environments. I think my partner was telling me that one of her career coaching people was going to try and work out of their car. So I think there are lots of people working in different environments, and so it's really third spaces are neither home nor work. And I think often, yes, increasingly universities are looking at third spaces for informal and formal outdoor learning. I think the reality is, given our climate and the extremes of climate, I think we need to have a different approach to make them actually sustainable places to spend time. So yes, that could be about making it technology, sort of enabled in terms of technology, but it also means shade. It also means a capacity, I don't know, to drink water. So I think it means lots of things, but I think at the moment a lot of our spaces are not really very adapted to that type of duration, I'd say.
There are so many good questions coming through. I'll just try and squeeze one more in at least. Are we seeing the increasing encroachment of public open space by market forces? For example, the Grand Prix takeover of Albert Park for several months of the year. So are market forces encroaching on our public spaces?
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to this idea that 30% of the city is not owned by the City of Melbourne. It's not owned by a local government. It could be owned by the state government. It could be owned by businesses, developers. There are lots of different ownership structures. So yes, and then I think any measure of whether that is a good use of public space should be about whether it has the sort of public benefit test. And I think obviously there are arguments around the public benefit of events like the Grand Prix, which I won't comment on specifically, but I think it's just, yes, this idea of public space being essentially free means that, which I think I obviously support that, but I think in making it free, we're not ascribing value. And I guess what we're trying to do as a practice is really try and interrogate what it means to try and capture the value, and I don't mean in a monetary way, but the real value to communities and to the environment of public spaces. And it's very complex science to it.
You know, like at Fed Square, the commercial use of the space is baked into its operating model from its very inception. It was built, but it had to self-fund itself from then on. So commercial activity has always been required to maintain the asset, let alone activate it, partner, program. So it will always be a combination of those things in this particular model.
I think we have to get a lot better at debating, and this is a public debate issue again, about where the public interest lies, because the privatisation of parts of footpaths for alfresco dining is absolutely in the public benefit up to a certain limit, right? Where's that limit? I think we have to have those debates about where the limit is, but I don't think there's much debate that we want to stop people eating on footpaths in Melbourne.
Really tempted to ask a whole lot more questions, but I suspect we probably can't, can we? No. Okay. All right. Thank you so much, all of you, for joining us for this Melbourne Conversations event in partnership with Fed Square. The next Melbourne Conversations event will be entitled Future-Proofing Green Spaces. So I think if you enjoyed this conversation, you'll probably enjoy that one. The QR code on our newsletter is on the screen now, so if you scan that, you can keep in touch. I'd like to thank our Auslan interpreters for their fantastic job. That's Nay and Kelly. Thank you all so much for coming out on a Melbourne night, and please join me in thanking all of our panellists.